Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Uncompromised with Chuck Mason, where we're continuing our series on dispensationalism and the church. What should Christians believe about the modern state of Israel? We're on part 3 today, and we're going to take a look at Isaiah chapter 11, which is a critical chapter for talking about the future of the state of Israel. The question is Israel today, is that a fulfillment of biblical prophecy? Or is that a fulfillment of Zionism? In the past episodes, which you'll find the links in the description, I've talked about the political implications and how much this is dividing the conservative movement that is going to affect the ability to win elections and to preserve America moving forward, whatever is left of our Judeo-Christian worldview in America. So it's really critical that we understand what the correct position or the accurate or historic position the church has always understood about Israel as Christians moving forward, so that we have the best witness in the world. I have a Master's of Divinity degree from Fuller Seminary, so we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive, kind of like you'd be sitting in a class at seminary. And as we dive down through this, we're going to take the first 10 verses today, and I'm going to give you the historic church's understanding of what they always believed these verses were saying. Next episode, we're going to do the dispensationalist understanding of these same 10 verses. But I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 11 from the English Standard Version. If you want to pause this, if you want to go grab a Bible or pull something up online so you can read and follow along, that would be helpful for you. So, starting in verse 1, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his root shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. So, throughout the history of the church and the history of dispensationalism, there's universal agreement that these first 5 verses are talking about Jesus. When it says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, Jesse was David's father, and we know that Jesus came through the house of David. He was David's descendant, and God promised that would eventually be Christ, but somebody from David's line would continually sit on the throne. So the church has understood that these 5 verses are talking about the rule and reign of Christ throughout history. But the question becomes, how is he ruling and reigning? And this is where the difficulty enters in from the beginning between what the historic church believed and dispensationalism. The historic church understood these passages as being what we call amillennial. The book of Revelation talks about Christ ruling and reigning for 1,000 years. And the church has always asked themselves, what does it mean for him to rule and reign? Especially when you have these first 5 verses being so specific, talking about Jesus reigning in very much an absolute sense throughout the world. And the church has always wrestled with what that meant. The amillennial position has always believed that the millennial rule that John talks about in the book of Revelation was symbolic from this standpoint, that the rule and reign of Christ happened in an amillennial position from Jesus' ascension until the day of his second coming. When time ends, all the dead are raised for judgment, and there's a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem when all creation is restored. The dispensationalists believe that millennium is a literal time where Jesus will return to earth in the rapture and rule from the nation of Israel, from a rebuilt third temple for a literal 1,000 years. But here's the challenge with that. Again, we want to handle the Bible literally, but those dispensationalist literal demands that are made, if you take a look at where the millennium falls in the book of Revelation, and it is only mentioned in the book of Revelation, that millennium is surrounded by imagery that no one takes literally. John talks about seeing a beast that rises out of the sea that has the amalgamation of the animals that Daniel speaks about in his vision. The feet of a lion and the body of a bear and the head of a leopard and on and on. Satan is portrayed as a serpent who's bound with a literal iron chain. Jesus is a lamb with, I think, 7 eyes and 7 horns. And yet dispensationalists take none of that literally. They would never believe that you would be in the final days watching a beast rise out of the sea, literally being a combination of body parts. So if we're not going to take those literally, why does the church take the millennium literally in that passage? And the church never did. Some of the early church fathers believed that we had a literal 1,000-year rule, but the consensus view was never it was a literal 1,000 years because of this. And so he is ruling and reigning today. Everything for the kingdom of God was fulfilled after the crucifixion and resurrection. We just don't see the complete fullness of that kingdom until those events of Revelation. Now, Jesus will rule and reign from the earth literally after everything is restored. But in the interim, we only see the kingdom manifesting itself more and more over time. Now, if that seems like a conundrum to you, we're going to work down through the rest of these, and we'll put this into perspective. It says, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fatted calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And in that day the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal for the peoples. Of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. So what are we supposed to do with this? How do we literally understand that the wolf shall dwell with the lamb and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat? Well, the church has always understood that there would be a literal fulfillment when the new Eden, when the new heaven and earth are restored, when we're living in eternity, when Jesus is ruling from the throne and within the visual imagery that we're given at the end of the book of Revelation. But what does that mean for us today? Throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus refers to Israel as sheep and as lambs. And what the church understood was wherever the church exists and wherever people are truly endeavoring to walk with God, that you had people who represented all of these nations, who represented the nations that were hostile to one another, that had obliterated and exterminated each other, that they lived together in true peace. Now, this is where people truly live the gospel. This is not where you have some state church ruling somewhere. And this is what we've seen throughout history, that as the gospel has moved forward and takes hold within a land, that you have a relative peace and a relative harmony, and you have an improvement of the lives of people, and you have a sense of biblical justice and biblical righteousness that has protected people throughout history. This is not a perfect scenario. Okay, this is not a matter of having our preferred, perfected image of what we think the world should be, but it remains undeniable. The human rights of the West, the fight for the rights of the unborn. We brought an end to Nazi Germany, and we have been winning the Cold War against Marxism. We have brought an end to these because of those principles in the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount and the example of Christ himself. And the church has always understood and always seen that wherever Christianity takes hold and truly transforms hearts and minds and nations, that advancement of the gospel is the advancement of the kingdom that brings forth at least a partial fulfillment of these first 10 verses. If you balk at that, I want you to think about this, that the freedom that we have here in America and the prosperity we have here in America, the human rights that we have here in America, the protection of women here in America, the protection of children here in America, on and on and on. These are all drawn from principles from the Jewish and Christian worldview. And each and every one of us feels it as that begins to decay. And that's simply an example of the way that the gospel has moved forward throughout the world. Now, all of this is by and large disputed by dispensationalists. Okay, they have a completely different way of seeing and understanding this. And that's where the dispute happens. But what if we had somebody who could help settle the dispute? What if we had maybe a great mind of the church to help us put this into perspective? One of the New Testament writers, maybe somebody like Paul. Let me read this to you. This comes from Romans chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 8. And Paul says, "For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. For as it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing to your name." Again it says, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." And again, "Praise the Lord, all you Gentiles, and let the peoples extol him." And again, Isaiah says, "The root of Jesse will come, and even he who arises to rule the Gentiles, in him will the Gentiles hope." Now, Paul is quoting Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, the concluding verse there, and he's purposefully quoting the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and here's the reason why. The Septuagint specifically says Gentiles. It specifically says, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, and he shall arise to rule over the Gentiles. In him shall the Gentiles trust, and in his rest be glorious." Paul is giving us the fullness of an understanding of this. And I'm going to go back to verse 8. For he says this, "I tell you that Christ came to be a servant to the circumcised, to Israel, to show God's truthfulness in the promises he made to the patriarchs." But Christ didn't come just for Israel. This fulfillment of this is not about Israel being raised in the last days. For Paul says in verse 9, "In order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." All of this has nothing to do with Israel alone. And that's why the church never looked to a fulfillment or a rebirth of Israel in the end times. Christ came, as Paul said, to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness and confirm the promise, in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. The kingdom is not about rebuilding a nation of Israel. The kingdom is about saving the world. And that's what Paul is showing us. And there becomes no greater authority to understand any of this than the Apostle Paul himself. And with that, we bring this study to an end. We'll go a little further into this in the next episode, and we're going to break down the dispensationalist view of this and help you to see where their expectations come from and how they don't align with the historic church. But once again, I'm Chuck Mason, and thank you for being a part of Uncompromised. If you have comments, if this has made you rage, let us know. Just drop us a line in the bottom. And this is a part of a study that we do, a Christ and Culture study that I do every week. If you want to be a part of that with a Zoom link, also let me know. But like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, God bless and stay safe.